For this section, we're going to study the male reproductive system. And the male reproductive functional unit is the testes. It is referred to as the gonad of the male anatomy. You will also hear the term gonad used with the female ovary. So they're interchangeable regarding the sex cell development structures in the male or female. But the testes reside in the scrotum, and this all corresponds to figure 7.2. And the testes are going to be found in the scrotum, and the scrotum is going to actually be essential because it can lower the temperature to allow the sperm to mature. The sperm have to be 1.2 degrees cooler than core temperature, and the scrotum can be lowered away from the core to give the testes a better chance of producing viable sperm. This muscle that can lower the scrotum is called the Cree master muscle, and the muscle that can actually lower the testes themselves inside the scrotum is the dartos muscle. But you'll also find that in the male testes we have what are called interstitial cells that produce testosterone. But in figure 7.2 we can see the major structures associated with the male reproductive system. Of course, the penis is going to serve a dual function. It's going to carry urine out of the bladder through the urethra, but it also is going to become erect and produce, this erection is going to produce an ejaculation when friction occurs, and ultimately sperm from the seminal vesicle will be released through the seminal duct into the urethra and carried out of the body by that tube, by the urethra. There are also other glands involved besides the seminal vesicle or seminal gland. It will also be referred to. The prostate gland and the bulbourethral gland, they also secrete fluid which is essential for the sperm to be able to have a fighting chance of getting to an ovum and fertilizing an egg in the female reproductive tract in the fallopian tube. The acidity gets neutralized by these fluids, and also it gives the sperm something to swim in. So here we see the structures associated with the male reproductive system. All right, in figure 7.3, we see all of the coiled up tubes that make up the testes. And those tubes are called the seminiferous tubules. And those seminiferous tubules are going to converge into a comma-shaped structure called the epididymis that ultimately gives the sperm a chance to mature. The sperm are going to make their way slowly through the seminiferous tubules, then the epididymis, and that gives them time to mature under the influence of the hormone testosterone. And when they ultimately get to the vas deferens or the ductus deferens, that's going to allow them to make the trip to the seminal gland or seminal vesicle, where they will be stored until the male ejaculates. The process of forming sperm in the testes is called spermatogenesis, and the testes again are also going to produce testosterone. That's a hormone that masculinizes the male, gives them bigger muscular structure, increases bone density, gives them facial hair, secondary sexual characteristics like a deeper voice, pubic hair, so on and so forth. All of that's due to the hormone testosterone. We'll also see the sperm itself. Okay, this is figure 7.5. And the sperm has the nucleus in its head. Of course, that carries half of the genetic material, the male contribution. We will see a mitochondria. The mitochondria is going to be the powerhouse of this cell. And we're going to see that there is a tail or flagellum that the mitochondria uses its energy to keep that tail moving, and ultimately that helps the sperm move through the liquid that gets secreted by the bulbourethral gland, the prostate gland, and the seminal gland, and gives it something to swim in as it makes its way through the female reproductive tract. Going back to figure 7.2, we can see those three important glands, the prostate gland, the seminal gland or seminal vesicle, and then the bulbourethral gland. You will oftentimes hear the bulbourethral glands referred to as the Cowper's glands. But the seminal vesicle produce about 60% of the seminal fluid, and that seminal fluid has a lot of the sugar fructose in it, and that helps to fuel the mitochondria, which causes the flagella to whip. There's the prostate gland, and you'll notice that the prostate gland actually is going to be surrounded, or excuse me, the urethra is going to be surrounded by the prostate gland. Okay, it's kind of a donut-shaped structure. And again, the urethra passes through that, and it secretes about 30% of seminal fluid, and it activates the sperm and makes the sperm's tail start moving. And then finally, we have the bulbourethral glands, and it has a secretion that's kind of like a mucus, and it too helps, again, to neutralize the acidity of the female reproductive tract, and also contribute to the fluid that the sperm have to swim in. When we talk about the male reproductive tract, we talk about the external genitalia, and that's the penis and the scrotum. Oops. And the penis, again, is going to serve a dual function. It's going to serve to get the urine out of the body from the bladder, but it must become erect in order for the male to enter the female and then produce friction for ejaculation. But here we can see there are, when we look at the penis, there are chambers called the Corpus Cavernosum and the Corpus Spongiosum. And those two areas have miles and miles of small vessels, and there's also connective tissue that surrounds them. And when that tissue becomes filled with blood, it presses against the connective tissue, and that connective tissue will ultimately keep those vessels from being able to expand outward, and that just makes the connective tissue very rigid, which is what ultimately produces the erection in the male. Okay. If the fascia that surrounds them, which is the connective tissue, would become damaged, then the male wouldn't be able to have an erection, and intercourse wouldn't be able to occur. Some of the other structures that we will talk about are the glans penis. That's the head of the penis. It would be covered by the foreskin if the male was uncircumcised. And of course, the removal of that foreskin is the process of circumcision. These are the major structures associated with the male reproductive system. One of the structures, the prostate gland, we talked about it a second ago. It's going to be a donut-shaped structure that surrounds the urethra. And ultimately, if it becomes enlarged, it produces a disease state called benign prostatic hyperplasia that's not cancer, but the cells become enlarged and ultimately they restrict the flow of urine out of the bladder. They can also restrict ejaculation. And as the size of the prostate increases, it will push on the walls of the bladder, making those muscles feel like they are full and being strained, and that leads to the male having to go frequently. But again, since the urethra is crimped off by the size of the growing prostate, they can't urinate very much. And so that's known as weak stream. And so medications such as Flomax might be used to treat a patient that has benign prostatic hyperplasia. But again, this is an overview of the male reproductive system.